Where are all the human fossils?
And why don't we see humans buried with dinosaurs today?
If there was a global flood, how come we don't see humans buried in the flood sediments? I'm Dr. Robert Carter. I'm sitting here with my good friend, Joel Tay.
Yes, thank you.
And we are having a really fun discussion on human fossils, Noah's flood, and questions that we get asked sometimes after our talks, at our events, sometimes online on Facebook. I'm trying to answer some YouTube videos that CMI produces when people jump on us saying, oh, how come we don't see human fossils in the fossil record? Excellent question.
So Rob, I was actually quite excited about this talk after we had the earlier discussion about this.
Yeah, sitting in the photocopier room, hashing out the arguments back and forth, wishing we had a camera then. Okay, we'll see how we'll do the second time.
Okay, so just to frame the whole thing, all human fossils that we know today, they are post-flood.
Yeah.
So how do we know that?
Actually, I wrote an article a couple of years ago, Are Neanderthals pre-flood? Because someone asked me that. They were convinced the Neanderthal fossils were pre-flood and modern humans are post-flood. But it's not true. Neanderthals are buried in shallow graves. They're buried in caves, in rock layers that have been formed by Noah's flood. And we carry Neanderthal genes. Therefore, obviously, humans and Neanderthals live together because they had babies together. So Neanderthals are post-flood.
Okay.
As well as all the other human fossils. Now, the evolutionists say us because humans didn't evolve until late and, had billions of years of fossil record and humans are only on the top.
Okay, so we believe that all human fossils are post-flood, yet as biblical creationists, we believe that the vast majority of fossils that we find are actually
flood
caused
fossils
by the flood.
Yeah, so that's a good question, and it raises a controversy, and it raises some discussion points that can be answered, and we're going to try to answer them here because we have a lot of points on our outline to go through. All right.
So first of all, why are most of the fossils that we find, why are they caused by the flood?
Noah's flood is a perfect recipe for fossilization. You have massive amounts of water washing around, massive amounts of sediments, things piling up quickly, things getting buried in sandy, gravelly sort of matrix away from predators, away from oxygen, away from bacteria, and then the minerals in the pore waters of those soon-to-be rocks start to crystallize, and we have fossils forming.
So we need rapid barrier catastrophe. These are the best conditions for fossils.
Yeah.
And
So Noah's flood predicts a massive amount of fossils, and creation has been saying that for decades.
Okay, so the flood layers form the fossils, and is that a reason why we find 95% of the fossils that we find are ocean-dwelling creatures?
Actually more than that. It's mostly clams.
Mostly clams. Okay.
Yeah.
So only a small percentage.
Yeah, clams and snails. Most of the fossil record is shellfish, basically.
Okay.
And then you have corals and sponges and algae, trilobites, things like that. Then some fish.
That's because the Bible says that the oceans come out from the sea onto the land?
Because the flood started in the oceans.
Okay.
And since it's a watery event, the things that lived in the water were the first things to die and get buried in massive numbers.
So 95% are invertebrates in the ocean. 4.75% is actually from plants, and only 0.25% are vertebrates. This is a tiny amount.
0.25% of fossils have a backbone.
Have a backbone. That's what it is.
Okay, that's amazing. And some of those are dinosaurs. Some of those are mosasaurs and fish and pterosaurs. And doesn't look like there's hardly any human fossils buried in the fossil record deeply. Now, I know there are people that say, oh, there's this fossil of a giant person buried in this layer. We tend to not go there.
Yes.
Most of our stuff says, looking at the fossil record, there really isn't any evidence of giant humans. We just made some people mad. That's fine. But also, there's no evidence of human fossils deep into the fossil record. That's just the way it is.
And one reason is that it's really hard to get fossils today.
Yeah, because the flood's over. You don't have this massive episode of sedimentary deposition happening anywhere. And so fossil formation happening today is rare.
Okay, but the Bible is clear that God created dinosaurs on day 6, land creatures, together with man.
The Bible says he created land animals together with man.
So that would include dinosaurs.
It would include dinosaurs now that we know that dinosaurs exist.
And yet we know that in the fossil record, dinosaurs and man are not found together. Why is that?
Well, how many different reasons can we think of?
Well, quite a few. I think first of all, we have what we call living fossils, right?
Yeah.
So what are living fossils? These are creatures that we find in the fossil record. And
And they're alive today.
They're still alive today, but we only find out certain what we call time frames in using evolutionary time.
Yeah, so horseshoe crabs.
Horseshoe crabs is a good
Yeah,
example.
they're all over the bay where I grew up. I saw horseshoe crabs all the time, and they're in the fossil record in some of the deeper layers of the fossil record. They're buried with trilobites. Trilobites are now extinct. But it's something like the coelacanth,
Yes.
that amazing fish that they thought was the primitive four-legged animal. You know, those stumpy legs were the evidence of the thing evolving into a land animal.
Yes.
In the evolutionary record, I mean, it's got a couple 100 million years of fossil representation.
Yeah.
And then it died out with the dinosaurs.
Yes, that's right.
And then they find it alive off of Madagascar. Now they find some in Indonesia also. And it's nothing like a transitional fossil.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just like the fossil representation. It hasn't changed.
Yes.
And yet we never found it buried with whales.
Yes, right.
And they live in the same ocean.
Yes.
So the entire evolutionary history of whales, coelacanths were right there. And we never find whales and coelacanths buried together. But we know they lived at the same time.
Okay, so the same thing would be with humans.
With humans, yeah. Just because we don't find humans buried with dinosaurs does not mean they didn't live at the same time. Because the fossil record is fickle.
Mm-hmm.
It preserved some things and it didn't preserve other things, even though they were contemporaneous.
Okay, so one of the explanations that some creationists give for why we do not find human fossils before the flood, they say that humans run to high ground.
Ah, yes. Running to higher ground.
And I understand that. I don't really like the argument.
I don't like that argument at all.
Yeah, why is
but
that?
I hear it a lot. Well, have you ever been outside during a torrential rainstorm?
Occasionally, but seldom, because the moment it starts to rain,
You go inside.
I hide in my house.
Fleeing to high ground would also presuppose that you thought a giant flood was coming.
Yes.
And unless you were Noah and his family, you probably didn't believe that there was a big flood coming.
Yeah, I think that's why when you have big localized floods, people get stranded in the houses all the time.
Yeah, there was a big flood right here in this area. When I first moved to this area, we lived in my house for a month and we had 30 days of rain every day. And on the last day, I think we had 10 or 11 inches of rain. And that little creek behind my house that was maybe a half a foot deep,
Mhm.
all of a sudden was 20 feet deep, 100 feet wide, and was flowing at about 10 or 15 miles an hour.
Oh, wow.
There's no way a human could cross that little creek.
And this was quite a while ago.
Well, 10 years ago, maybe.
Oh, just 10 years ago.
But I saw it happen. I mean, this little creek became huge because of torrential rains.
And you were stranded.
And we were stranded. On our street, there was 4 ways to get off of the street, and 3 of those ways were either underwater or the bridge had been washed out. So we were almost trapped. And if my house was right next to this little creek and it was in danger of being washed away. But if my house started getting inundated, I would have grabbed my wife and kids and we would have fled to higher ground.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Which is 100 feet away. We wouldn't have been able to say, hey, we need to fly to the North Georgia mountains. And if we thought that, we never would have been able to get there.
Ah, it's interesting.
So flee to higher ground means a local topological high point, not a global topological high point. Humans cannot migrate over vast different distances during a massive flood.
So what is this idea about fleeing to high ground? Why would fleeing to high ground actually not result in fossils? What's the rationale behind that?
Well, it's really an older argument. And the idea is that because you're smart and you're intelligent, unlike an animal, which is dumb, right? They're just going to die. Humans are going to be like, oh, I'm going to walk uphill.
Yes.
If you're the last thing buried, maybe you wouldn't be petrified as well as the first things buried.
Ah, okay.
I think that's where the argument comes from. But neither you nor I really like this very much because practically it just doesn't work. There's another argument people used to use. Some people still do. I'm not a big fan of it. It's called the float and bloat.
What's that?
Well, if when humans die, they float. And therefore, they don't get buried in sedimentary rocks.
Okay, yes.
But that's not quite true.
Why is that?
Because human bodies sink. This is why we drown.
But don't we read about people who drown in the river and then their body floats up after a few days?
Yeah, exactly. After a few days, as decompositional gases start building up in the body cavity, the body can float.
Yes.
And it'll float for a while, but then when the gases burst open the abdominal cavity, and they sink again. And so they don't last a long time on the surface. Obese people with a lot of fat, they can float when they're dead.
Okay.
Most people don't. And even if they do, they don't last long. And if you're on the bottom and if your body's being attacked by any sort of a crab or a fish or something that's a consumer, it's going to poke holes in that body cavity and the body's not going to float.
It's still going to sink to the bottom.
Yeah, just like the whale that they just found off of California last week. It was an intact whale lying on the bottom of the ocean.
Which is interesting because a lot of people think that when whales die, they float to the top.
No, they don't. Sometimes they can.
Okay.
A decomposing, nasty, stinky whale can have enough gases in it and maybe enough fat in it that it'll float.
Okay.
But the pieces break off, individual pieces sink, or the entire animal, this animal, the skeleton is complete. It's just lying on the bottom of the ocean being decomposed. Never floated.
Which is interesting too, because some people use the bloat and float argument as a reason for why we don't find human fossils. But that should apply to all these other animals as well.
And it should apply to all the other ones also. Unless humans were buried late in the flood and floated and bloated, and other things that floated and bloated early made us sunk, maybe there's a timing differential. But it just sounds like special pleading to me, so I don't go there.
So what are some better explanations that we have?
Well, how many do we come up with? We came up with like 5 or 6.
Yes, quite a few actually.
I like the needles in a haystack argument.
Yes, that's my favorite too. But what's that exactly?
Well, how many humans were alive at the flood?
Well, the Bible says that God created mankind, created them starting with 2, Adam and
2,
Eve.
yeah.
And we know that the flood occurred about 1,600 years later,
Give
plus
or take,
minus a little bit. So we really do not know how many humans were alive at the time of the flood.
No, but the Bible only says that he created 2 humans. It doesn't say anything about any other species, how many organisms God created.
Okay, so assuming by the time of the flood, we have, even if you're going to be generous, 10 million people alive on Earth at the time.
And I doubt it's that much.
Yeah, I doubt so, because the Bible says that, the Earth was filled with violence.
Yeah, the Earth is filled with violence.
Yes.
So, yeah, I don't think there's that many people. Okay, but even if there was, there's a lot of sedimentary rocks in the world.
Yes.
And you ran the calculation. What was the number that you got? Did you get this out of the Creation Answers book?
Yeah, the Creation Answers book. Go check it out. We have some, we have the calculations there. So basically, it's saying that if we assume that we have 10 million people at the time of the flood, and we already say that's generous, if we divide that by 700 million cubic kilometers of sediments, that's only 1 human for every 70 cubic kilometers.
That's all 70 cubic kilometers of rock with 1 human skeleton in it. Needles in a haystack. We simply might never have found the humans that are buried deep in the fossil record.
That's right. And then, I think most of the fossils were not even, most of the people who died will not even become fossils.
That's the second argument.
That's the second
The
argument.
rarity of fossilization. Just because you're dead doesn't mean you're going to fossilize. You have to be buried in a rapidly accumulating sedimentary pile. And even then, you might not fossilize. You can still rot.
Yes. So it's almost impossible to find one.
If you don't have a lot of humans, you're probably not going to get a human fossil. That's the basic argument.
So this goes to the next explanation, late stage of death. So what's that?
Given a flood scenario where we have lots of sedimentary rocks forming,
Yes.
later on in the flood, it's possible that the rate of rock formation slowed down.
Okay.
So if humans maybe lived at higher elevation in the first place, or if they're buried later, or they died later in the flood, maybe they died during a time when there wasn't a lot of rock being manufactured, therefore their bodies wouldn't be able to be trapped in the rocks.
Okay.
I don't really believe that. It depends on where you draw the flood post-flood boundary.
Yes.
I know a lot of people at CMI are leaning toward a high
Yeah, I'm starting to
high in the Cenozoic. I mean, Tim Clary at ICR is doing some phenomenal work in that and really pushing me in this direction. I used to think of the KT or the KPG, where the dinosaurs died out, that's the end of the flood, because there's this nice break between types of fossils and other types of fossils. Yeah, I don't hold to that anymore.
Yeah, same here.
But if the flood is in the late Cenozoic, that means there's a massive amount of rocks being formed in the Cenozoic in the flood. So I can't go with maybe humans died later when there's less rock formation. No, there's still lots of rock formation in the end stages.
Okay. So even if humans did run to higher ground and they're rapidly buried in those higher layers, we wouldn't expect to find the fossils, because what happens when the flood subsides?
The last things that are laid down are the first things to be eroded.
So that means the top layers
Top
will be
layers
eroded away.
get eroded first. I heard a very interesting talk at the last International Conference of Creationism.
Yes.
And the speaker was saying some controversial things that made some people a little uncomfortable.
Uh-huh.
But one of the things he said was, what flood post-flood boundary?
Mhm.
It's been eroded.
You have to explain that. I mean, I understand that, but for our viewers,
After the flood is over, rocks are not deposited anymore. The water subsides.
Uh-huh.
And the first thing that happens is massive amounts of erosion happen to the entire Earth's surface that's exposed to the atmosphere.
Yes.
And so whatever is deposited last is being heavily eroded.
So you're actually saying that the flood boundary
Doesn't
Would
really exist.
doesn't really exist. So what we have is early flood and post-flood,
Yeah.
but not so much the late flood.
Yeah, a lot of late flood stuff will be destroyed.
It's interesting. Okay.
But see, there's also an ecological component to the flood.
What do you mean by that?
Well, the first thing buried are marine organisms.
Okay.
The next thing buried are like swampy edge of the
Yes.
continents organisms. Then you have organisms from higher ground.
Uh-huh.
So there's an ecological component to that, and it's successive and it's in order. And
Flood
if
buried.
humans are buried here, that's the part that's getting erased first.
Ah, interesting. Okay.
Another thing that might have destroyed human fossils is subduction.
What's that?
Well, it's continental drift. Plates diving under other plates. If humans are buried in a place where there's a subduction zone, maybe the human fossils have been melted by now.
It's interesting.
I mean,
as well.
catastrophic plate tectonics is an idea that I think all of us at CMI hold to, at least mostly.
And so what's that? So a catastrophic plate tectonics, CPT, is referring to massive movement of plates during the flood.
During the flood. In fact, the flood was probably propelled by plate movement and plates moving not at the rate your fingernails grow, but about as fast as you could walk or you can run.
Yes.
So catastrophic plate tectonics, lots of subduction, a lot of things being deposited have now been brought underneath into the mantle and have melted.
So we have multiple explanations for why we do not find human fossils today.
Multiple.
Okay.
And we know the fossil record is fickle.
Hmm.
We know that things that live together are not buried together because they're alive now. And we don't find them together in the fossil record. So just because we don't find humans buried with dinosaurs, just because we don't find lots of humans deep in the fossil record, that doesn't actually mean anything.
But I have one last question.
Okay.
It is this. If we do indeed find a pre-flood human fossil, would we be able to recognize it?
Excellent question. Because I don't think modern humans necessarily look exactly like ancient humans.
Mm-hmm.
And most ancient humans, they look, Neanderthal, Homo erectus, Denisovan. Modern humans look a little different.
Okay.
We're not as strongly built as our ancestors, things like that.
But again, those are post-flood, right? So
And they're post-flood too, but the earliest human fossils don't look like you and me necessarily.
So if I do find a human fossil that is from before the flood, will I assume that that's an early post-flood fossil?
You probably assume that it's an early human offshoot of chimpanzees or something like that. I don't know what the evolutionists say. But they'd also probably say, oh no, this isn't, this human fossil didn't come from this part of the fossil record. It was reworked.
Uh-huh.
It was eroded from somewhere else and deposited in this layer. Or it was a burial. Someone dug a hole and put a human in it and then filled it in again. And therefore, that's why it looks like it's buried in this rock layer, but it's really not. The human died out millions of years after this rock layer was laid down.
So in other words, what you're saying is that the evolutionary mindset will actually cause them to reinterpret this so that it's placed at a much later date.
Yeah. And you can also redate the entire rock layer. Oh, we thought this rock layer was older, but it's actually much younger than we thought. There's examples of these things.
Okay.
These things have happened.
Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, I guess we have already shown many reasons for why we don't really find pre-flood human fossils.
Many potential reasons.
Potential reasons. Okay.
We didn't actually answer conclusively because it can't be answered conclusively.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the nature of history and the nature of the historical sciences. No one was there to see it. It wasn't like we had scientists recording on a notepad, all this processes happening. That's not true. And so we're left with a giant void called history that we're trying to fill in with interpretive ideas. And that's what this is, an interpretive idea of history that can possibly explain this question. But the question is not really that big a deal. And there's no reason for a skeptic to jump on us saying, hey, you think that humans live with dinosaurs? How come you don't find any humans buried with dinosaurs? Ha ha ha. And I'm like, yeah, whatever.
Yeah, and I think the needle in the haystack argument, that just answers that perfectly for me as well.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
I hope you enjoyed Joel and my lighthearted discussion on this topic. If you like these sort of things, tune into creation.com talk. Go to creation.com, look up some of our articles. We're on YouTube. We have a Facebook group. We're all over the internet. And in fact, if you want to have a CMI speaker come to your church or your organization, just contact us and we'll send someone out and come to you to answer some more questions.